Thanks very much, Julie. My name's Portland Jones. Welcome to the second part of the Horses Hate Surprise Party webinar on equitation science for riders. I run a training and coaching business in Western Australia, and I also teach equitation science at university over here. So today I thought in the second part of the webinar that we would talk about the different ways in which horses learn. So have you ever watched one of those programs where they show you how famous magicians do tricks? It sort of turns out always that it doesn't matter how incredible the tricks are, they're not magic after all, they're just really the result of a lot of hard work and practice. And good horse training is just the same. It might look like magic, but mostly it's just really consistent practice. So all of the behaviours that horses do under saddle are the result of just 6 responses. We call those the foundation responses because they form the foundation of the horse's future training. And these are almost entirely trained by operant conditioning, and we'll talk about that later. And operant conditioning is probably the most important tool in the horse trainer's toolkit. So those foundation responses are 1, stopping, and that as training progresses includes both shortening and slowing. 2, going forwards, which also will include lengthening and quickening once the horse is more correctly trained. 3, turning the shoulders right, turning the shoulders left, yielding the hindquarters right, and yielding the hindquarters left. And all these behaviours are again trained by operant conditioning. And we're sort of going to go forwards now, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different ways that horses learn and how they learn those 6 foundation responses. But I just need to remind you that although there are some sort of sciencey words in there, it really is just a pretty simple ideas behind things, and you definitely don't need to know the words in order to understand the concepts. So the first one that we're going to talk about today is operant conditioning, and whenever I use this grid to show people operant conditioning, I know their eyes glaze over and they kind of go, oh my god, it's sort of really boring and not at all relevant to horse training, but it's really useful to understand it because you can see that there are 2 kinds of reinforcement on the grid and 2 kinds of punishment, and both kinds of reinforcement make behaviour happen more often, while punishment makes the behaviour happen less often. And it's really important to distinguish here that you can see that both positive and negative are used in the mathematical sense of the words. That means adding and subtracting, not as in good and bad. And that's a really important distinction to make. Positive means adding, negative means taking away. It doesn't mean positive means good and negative means bad. It's a mathematical way of talking about behaviour. And so you can see that there are 4 kinds of operant conditioning, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail now. So the first one we'll look at in more detail is positive reinforcement. So that's giving your horse something that he likes after a behaviour makes him more likely to do it again. So for example, scratching him on the neck or giving him a carrot when you've caught him makes him more likely to be caught again. And positive reinforcement must be made to be meaningful. So when we look at positive reinforcement, we need to work out what the horse likes and give him that, because it only becomes meaningful when it's something that he likes. So for instance, horses don't particularly enjoy patting, so big loud slaps on the necks followed by, good boy yelled in his ear is probably not going to work as positive reinforcement for your horse. A lot of horses, particularly ex-race horses, take a long time to acknowledge that the positive reinforcement of scratching. You almost have to train them to find that enjoyable, but it's really worthwhile doing, and you can scratch a little place on the horse's neck just below his wither, kind of where your hand would go naturally if you were sitting on him, sort of at the base of between his wither and his neck. And if you scratch there and up and down his neck, you'll eventually find the spot that the horse likes, and you'll be able to tell that he likes it because he'll make a funny face and quite often lift his lip up, and sometimes he might even try to scratch you himself. And that place there can become really positively reinforcing for the horse, so it can be really useful to find that place and use it. Positive reinforcement is a really good way of improving behaviours and increasing calmness. It's really important to remember though that the reward has to be given at the exact moment the horse does what you want him to do. So if you lead your horse back to the stable after you ride him and give him a carrot, you're not reinforcing his good behaviour during the ride, you're reinforcing what he did just before he ate the carrot. And positive reinforcement is particularly effective when it's used in conjunction with negative reinforcement, which we'll talk about next. Used in this way, it increases or amplifies the reinforcing effect of the removal of pressure, and we call this combined reinforcement. So a lot of you will have heard of the term clicker training, and positive reinforcement is the form of training that clicker training utilises. So what happens in clicker training is that they pair a food reward usually with a distinctive sound, in this instance from a little device called a clicker, and eventually the horse learns to predict that the distinctive sound means the reward is coming, so that the clicking sound in itself becomes reinforcing. It's always paired with the treat, because without the treat it would quickly lose its value. And that's how clicker training works. The click is just a way of telling the horse, yes, that's the correct behaviour, or reinforcing at the exact instant. It's not a way of cueing the horse to do various behaviours or a way of rewarding him for it. It's just a way of connecting the treat and a moment in time. The next form of operant conditioning we're going to look at is negative reinforcement, and this is taking away something that the horse doesn't really like after a behaviour makes him more likely to do that behaviour again. So for instance, when you put your leg on when you are riding the horse, when the horse goes forward, you take your leg off. That means that the next time you put your leg on, the horse is much more likely to go forward. The horse spends his entire life trying to avoid aversive pressures, and he's really good at it, and he remembers it really clearly, the ways in which he removes them. So negative reinforcement is the most reached for tool in the horse rider's toolkit. Any form of training that uses pressure is negative reinforcement. So when you lead or ride your horse, you are using negative reinforcement because the cues that you use involve pressure. When horse training goes wrong, it's quite often because negative reinforcement has been used incorrectly. Because horses are really good at forming associations, once trained, the pressure used in negative reinforcement can and should be really, really light. And that's the beauty of negative reinforcement. In certain situations it can be made to be a little bit aversive, so that it's possible to stop a horse that is being frightened by something, say for instance a dog, but it is also can and should be really light in most situations. We can think of the ways of applying negative reinforcement as having three phases. So the light signal, which is very much like saying please to the horse. So that's when you just very lightly close your leg against the side of the horse. The stronger signal, which is when you increase or maybe even vibrate your leg against the side of the horse, is applied if the light signal doesn't produce the desired results. And this is a little bit like saying to the horse, do it now. And the release of the signal is when you take your leg off, and this is very much like saying thank you. There is no gap between the light signal and the heavier signal. And in fact, if you use intermittent pressures like, say, whip tapping in negative reinforcement, the taps must be very close together, because taps of more than a couple of seconds are perceived by the horse to be a cessation of pressure or an end of the pressure. So therefore, your tapping must go tap, 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 not tap, 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 because otherwise the horse has difficulty in connecting the taps and understanding that they are an unbroken form of pressure. The release of the pressure is the most important part of the signal, because it's not the cue that trains the horse, it's the removal of the pressure that trains him. And this is really important for us to remember, especially if we're sort of embedded in different forms of riding systems that privilege the way that privilege the aid. And when we have horses brought to us in our training business, we often have people say, oh, I'm sure he doesn't go forward because I don't have very strong legs, or I'm sure he doesn't stop because I don't have very strong arms. But it's very rarely that's the case at all. And in fact, well-trained horses go from extremely light pressures. It's all about the release of the pressure. And it's the most important thing to remember is that the release targets the behaviour that you want. And I often think about negative reinforcement a little bit like going shopping for the correct behaviour. So, you know, you put your leg on the horse and you continue increasing the pressure of your leg until the horse does what it is that you want him to do, and at which point you take your leg off completely. It's a little bit like going to the shop. You walk into the shop looking for, let's say, bread because you want to make a sandwich. And just because the first thing that you see on the aisle is newspapers doesn't mean you have to buy newspapers, because newspapers don't make very good sandwiches. You must keep walking till you get to the bread aisle. When you get to the bread aisle, you buy the bread. It's the same with a horse. You only release the pressure for the behaviour that you want. The next form of operant conditioning that we're going to talk about is positive punishment. Now, positive punishment is when you add something that the horse doesn't like in order to make him less likely to do it again. So, for example, getting shocked by an electric fence makes the horse less likely to touch the fence in future. Now, punishment is a little bit of a problem, and we really need to think very carefully about it before you use it, any kind of punishment in training. And I really think that ethically, if we use a punishment in training and it doesn't work 2 or 3 times, then we really need to rethink the way that we're training the horse. I mean, in theory, you know, smacking the horse for biting should make it less likely to bite in the future, but in practice it rarely works like that. In reality, punishment is less effective than is often believed, and I think this is because punishment is inherently reinforcing to the people that use it, which is sort of shows it not a particularly nice side of human nature, I believe. There are lots of risks when we use punishment, and a few of them are things like punishment can make this horse very scared of whoever punished him, because it can form really powerful associations between the punisher and the punishee. And we can see this particularly in horses that have finished racing. A lot of them are very frightened of the whip, and it's because they've made a very strong association between the whip and the punishment. And we don't want that to happen to us as trainers, and because A, it's not ethical, and B, it's not practical either. Punishment is non-directive. That's what scientists say, and what we mean by that is that it doesn't tell the horse what to do. It only tells the horse what not to do. So if you smack the horse for biting, you don't have any say in the behaviour that he offers you once he's bitten you. What you might do is you might get a different behaviour, and it mightn't be the behaviour that you want. So for instance, instead of biting, he might rear, and that's a much worse behaviour that you don't want. Punishment expects the horse to change his future behaviour to avoid consequences in the future. And when I tell this to my university students, even though most of them are only 19 or 20, I always say to them, hands up if you've had a speeding fine. And probably 50% of them put their hands up. And I say, okay, of those of you that have put your hands up who's had 2 speeding fines. And probably 50% of them keep their hand up. And I say, well, you are obviously an example of someone who for whom punishment is not effective. Because if punishment was completely effective, there would be no such thing as people that had 2 speeding fines or repeat offenders in our jails. And that's obviously not the case. So there is a big problem with punishment, and it really is worthwhile considering very well whether or not you use it or not. It's far more useful in almost all situations in training to use negative reinforcement instead of positive punishment. So for instance, if your horse nips you when you tighten the girth, it's much better to use negative reinforcement to step him back or perhaps lower his head than to give him a smack, because it targets the behaviour that you want, not just the one that you don't want. So if you smack the horse for nipping, it only teaches him what not to do, and it teaches him nothing about the way you want him to behave. Positive punishment has lots of really negative effects, including reducing the horse's capacity to trial new behaviours. So horses that are trained with a lot of punishment quite often don't like to try doing new things because they're frightened that they'll be punished for it. It can also cause physiological changes such as increased corticosteroid levels, increased heart rate and blood pressure. It can cause powerful fear associations between the punisher and the punishee, as I've explained, and it also can lead to the onset of learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness, which is the subject that I did my PhD on largely, is a really terrible state, emotional state in horses and other animals and humans when an animal or the human stops trying to change their environment for the better. And it means that the animal takes no pleasure in things that otherwise were pleasurable for it, and they become very dull and listless. And learned helplessness is a real risk when we train with a lot of punishment. So the other form of punishment that has been used in training is negative punishment. And this one's not often used in horse training, but is often used by parents. So taking away something that the horse likes when he does the wrong thing makes him less likely to do the wrong thing in the future. So if you're scratching your horse on the wither and he tries to bite you and you stop scratching him, you're in effect using negative punishment because you're reducing the likelihood that that behaviour will occur again. Removing food and water from horses is sort of ethically not really okay. So we don't really use those in training, and because of course of the horses got such an sensitive gut. So we'd never do anything like that. So that's about the only way I can think of using negative punishment with the horse. So negative punishment is hard to use with horse training, but extremely easy to use it as a parent. So I always ask my university students if they remember when their parent took away their mobile phone because they had done something wrong, and most of them have had that done to them at some stage. So that's negative reinforcement. Sorry, negative punishment. The next kind of learning, so that's operant conditioning, so all done. And now we're going to talk about habituation, which is just another way that horses learn. And habituation is just a really fancy, sciencey way of saying getting used to. As a part of their training, riding horses have to habituate to lots of different things like the saddle, the weight of the rider, the wind in the trees, and cars on the road. So when they're correctly trained, most horses will habituate pretty quickly to the everyday things in their environment. However, some things are hard to habituate to. Those are things that are too close. So for instance, clippers in the horse's ears, things that are too loud, so like thunder, things that appear suddenly, so like a kangaroo, or move erratically, like a plastic bag blowing in the wind, or perhaps a toddler with a Thomas the Tank Engine umbrella, as I can attest to. And those are things that are hard to habituate to. So when we habituate the horse to things, we desensitize him to them. And there are about 6 different ways to desensitize or help your horse habituate to things like, and for today we'll use the example of the clippers. So number 1 would be systematic desensitization. So that would occur when you turn the clippers on while the horse is in the stable, and eventually over time the horse will get used to the sound of the clippers. Number 2, counter conditioning, and this is where you turn the clippers into a signal that predicts something really nice is coming. So basically you turn the clippers on and then you give the horse a treat. And then you do that several times, and eventually when you turn the clippers on, the horse gets excited because he expects to get that he's going to get a treat. And in this way we can turn the fear-producing stimulus of the clippers into one that is positively reinforcing. And counter conditioning works really well for horses that are shy of the girth when you girth them up, and things like that can be made that to habituate quickly to that. Overshadowing. Overshadowing occurs when 2 stimuli are presented at the same time. Only one of them will get a response. Now I'm going to talk about overshadowing in much more detail on the next slide, so I'll leave that one for now. Approach conditioning. So this is when we make the horse chase what is frightening, and this works because horses are naturally curious, and as part of their curiosity they often approach frightening objects. So if we make the horse approach something that's frightening, let's say like the clippers, which is a little bit hard to do because obviously you would need either battery operated clippers or a really long extension cord, but we usually use approach conditioning for things like the quad bike or the tractor at home. So you can drive the quad bike away from the horse and have a handler take the horse towards the quad bike, always allowing the quad bike to get a little bit more distance from the horse until the horse is really confident, and then you can approach it closer and closer. And approach conditioning is a really useful way of desensitizing the horse to moving objects. And it works really well with large balls if you've seen, horses playing with big fit balls. Stimulus blending. So this is when you would use a known stimulus to introduce a novel one, and this can work really well for things like fly spray. So for instance, if the horse is already habituated to the feeling of a hose and being hosed, you can actually use introduce the fly spray while you are hosing the horse on the same part of the horse's body that is being used that is being hosed. So you can sort of hold the spray and the hose in the same hand and spray the horse lightly at the same time as hosing him, and then gradually take the hose away so that the horse is left with the feeling of the fly spray on his body and not the hose on his body anymore. This will also quite useful for horses that are head shy. So a lot of horses that are head shy don't like the human's hand on their head, but don't mind being rubbed with something like a towel. So you can rub the horse's head very gently with a towel and slide your fingers under the towel and just let him touch his head with your fingers, so he gradually gets used to the feeling of your fingers on him as well. The last form of habituation that we're going to talk about is response prevention. So preventing this flight response assists with rapid habituation. So that is when we make the horse stand still while there's scary objects. So making the horse stand still while you introduce the clippers and things like this will assist with rapid habituation. But the really important thing to remember about habituation is that it must be done really, really gradually and progressively. When it's done all at once, it's called flooding, and that can make the horse more scared of the object than ever before. Now, humans will subject themselves to flooding. So, for instance, people that are really scared of spiders will get into a glass box and have spiders put all over the top of it. And that's okay because humans choose to do that, but the horse doesn't choose to be trained, and so we must avoid flooding at all costs. And the other thing to mention about flooding is that it's very subjective, and what is flooding for one horse won't be flooding for another. So if the horse is really frightened of something, then that making him put up with it is all at once is flooding. It's got to be done more gradually. You've got to separate the scary thing out into all to its different scary parts. So the clippers might be scary because they smell scary, or they might be scary because they feel scary, or they might be scary because they sound scary. And you've got to work out a way of presenting each part of that scariness separately, so that the horse, is used to the feel of the clippers all over his body before you turn them on. And is used to the smell of them before you put them on his body. So that's a really important thing to remember about habituation. It's very important to avoid flooding at all costs. Now the next form of learning is overshadowing, and as we talked, this is a way of desensitizing the horse. So the horse can't multitask, so which means he can only do one thing at a time. And when two pressures are presented at the same time, only the strongest one will get a response. During overshadowing, the horse is asked to respond to cues that have already been trained, such as stop and go forwards, while something new is introduced. Because he can only focus on one thing at a time, he gradually habituates to the new thing. Overshadowing is both a good and a bad thing, and it can be used to improve or destroy training. If you use two signals at once, like for instance when you're riding, if you use your hand and your leg together, the horse will habituate to one of them. That's why a lot of horses are both heavy to stop and go signals. And it's why in times of stress your horse's responses to the signals might be heavier than usual. So when you take your horse to the show, when you start to lead him around at the beginning, he might be really heavy. That's because he's really focusing on the show and not listening to your signals. It's like trying to imagine doing your maths homework on a roller coaster. It'll be really hard. That's because the experience of being on a roller coaster overshadows your ability to concentrate on your maths homework. If you went on the roller coaster lots and lots, it would become less scary because of that, and because you've probably had then lots of exposure and no bad experiences like falling off or crashing. And then you'd get better at doing maths homework on the roller coaster. But if you were punished because you couldn't concentrate doing your maths homework on a roller coaster, you'd probably just get more anxious and be less able to do your homework. And that's what happens to the horse when he goes to a show. He gets very heavy in the responses. And it's very important that we just are very clear in the training and calmly take things slowly until he is light in his responses, and then he too gets better at doing his maths homework on a roller coaster. Now, shaping is another form of learning, and it describes the process of gradually changing behaviours so that they get better and better over time. For example, when you first teach a young foal to lead, you wouldn't expect it to walk perfectly beside you on the first attempt. Rather, you'd reward better and better versions of leading until you gradually change and improve the behaviour. Now, Michelangelo, the famous artist, said that he didn't think sculpting was very hard because he was asked how he was able to make such amazing sculptures. He said, it's not hard. You just take a hammer and a chisel and a great big block of marble and you chip off all the bits that you don't want until what you've got left is a beautiful statue. And that's a really good way to think about training a horse. You just get rid of all the behaviours that you don't want, like shying, bucking and balking at jumps, until what you're left with is a really well-trained horse. The most important thing to remember about shaping behaviours is that controlling the legs of the horse with light cues is the most fundamental goal that we should have when we're training. It's much more important than controlling where the horse's head goes or trying to work out what the horse is thinking. We can't possibly imagine what the horse is thinking, so we could concentrate on achieving obedience and calmness in every training situation, particularly the legs. We must focus on shaping our control of the legs. Now, classical conditioning is the next form of training that we're going to look at, and it's a really important one because it's when an association is formed between a new signal and a response. Here's an example. If you open a bag of carrots and give your horse some, pretty soon your horse will hear the crackle of the bag and rush over to get a carrot because an association has been formed between the crackling sound and the carrot. The crackling sound has been classically conditioned to mean that carrots on their way. You've probably heard of Pavlov's dogs. Now, Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist who was very famous in the early days of the 20th century. He conducted experiments on dogs to try and learn more about the way that they digested their food. And every day his assistant would bring the dogs some meat and Pavlov would measure the amount of saliva that they produced. Now, apparently Pavlov's assistant had a trolley with a squeaky wheel, and pretty soon the dogs would start to slobber and drool, or salivate, as scientists say, as soon as they heard the trolley squeaking down the hall outside the lab. And Pavlov was very interested in this and he decided to do an experiment to work it out. So he rang a bell and then he fed the dogs. And after several repetitions, when he rang the bells, the dogs would drool as if they were expecting food. Pavlov called what he had discovered classical conditioning. Now, your seat, weight and voice cues work in horse training just the way the bell did with Pavlov's dogs. They work because they become associated through classical conditioning with other cues that have been trained by operant conditioning. So here's an example. When you ride, your seat moves in time to the horse's movement. As you slow your horse with the reins, your seat moves less. Your horse very quickly learns that less movement from your seat means that the rein signal for slow down is coming, and he'll slow down when he feels your seat slow. And the opposite's also true. When your horse feels the movement of your seat increase, he'll often speed up. The same is true for the word whoa. The horse isn't born, of course, understanding that the word whoa means slow down. But over time he learns to associate it with slowing signals from the reins and the lead rope. So pretty soon the word whoa will cause him to slow down. Over his lifetime, the horse learns many, many classically conditioned cues. So he'll start to get excited when he sees the feed room door open. He'll neigh when he sees you in the morning, and he'll be wary of the green overalls that the vet wears. Classical conditioning is a really important part of the training if you understand it and use it well. But it is, however, worth remembering that Pavlov's dogs stopped drooling when the bell was rung after a few repetitions if they weren't given meat afterwards, which means that your seat won't work if the horse is not also obedient to your leg and rein cues. Plus, Pavlov fed the dogs something they really liked, not broccoli. So I don't think they'd have salivated much at all for broccoli. So that means if you want to make sure your seat is an effective cue, make sure your horse stops obediently and lightly from the reins first, because as we spoke of before, that is the foundation of all of the training. So the go and stop, turn and yield aids are the foundation upon which the house is built, and the house in this instance includes things like your seat, weight and voice aids. Classically conditioned behaviours are a bit like remote-controlled toy cars. You've got to keep charging them in order for them to work. So with classically conditioned behaviours, you've got to keep making the connection between the operant behaviour, which is your rein signal, and the classically conditioned cue like whoa. Otherwise, they simply stop working. So to finish off, we're just going to quickly go through 10 principles of training that I think should be on every tack room door. So number one, the horse's brain is very different from ours. His memory and senses and ways of learning are very different too. It's really important that we understand these differences and always remember them when training. For example, horses can't pretend or tell lies, and they never do things just to annoy us, even if it does seem like sometimes they do. It's important for us, rule number two, understand the scientific principles of training. So we've already done that today because we all understand now how operant conditioning, habituation, classical conditioning and shaping work. Every signal that we use with the horse should be different and distinct so that there's no confusion for the horse. So for example, the signal used for turn should be easily distinguished from the signal for go and the signal to stop. And that's why in our training system we avoid using the leg for turn, because then it becomes confused with both the signal for go and the signal for yield. We just simply use an opening turning aid for turn. Don't have unrealistic expectations when you're first training responses. You've got to reward every single good try, reward small improvements, and understand that the shaping process takes time. Michelangelo was a famous sculptor, and he just took a little bit of marble from the sculpture every day. So just small chips, and that's the best way to go on. Number 5, horses can't multitask, so only ever give one cue at a time. For example, don't ask for stop and go at the same time, because this is impossible for the horse and causes the horse great stress. Number 6, every signal should produce only one response. For example, pressure on both reins should only ever cause the horse to slow his legs. It shouldn't also be used to make the horse assume that on the bit position or to lower his head. 7, be consistent with your horse at all times, both on the ground and under saddle. The rules should never change. This is why we train our horses in our system never to follow your legs when leading. So the horse should come forward and go backwards from pressure cues, not just because you went there with your body. Because when you tie your horse up to the float or put him in the float or go to saddle him up, he won't be able to follow your legs, and that can lead to great deals of confusion for the horse. Number 8, make self-carriage a priority every day and at every stage of training. That means you must train your horse to maintain the speed you want while he's being ridden and led without being constantly cued to do so. So he doesn't have to constantly be asked to go forwards or to slow down. You should aim to control your horse with the lightest pressure cues possible. Number 9, learn what the flight response looks like. Understand that it's a problem and learn to control it during training. Remember, the flight response is rewarded by 2 things, fast and far. Fast legs and being far away from the object that frightens him. So when we understand this, then we can train the horse so that we avoid expressions of the flight response. Number 10, having a calm and obedient horse should be your ultimate goal at all times, in every ride and in every situation. Thanks very much for joining in on the webinar. I must thank Julie Fiedler and Horses SA, not just for hosting this webinar, but also for the ongoing support of equestrian endeavour in Australia. Thank you very much, Julie.